In this second part, we are going to cover what are the major approaches to the history of modern India. In previous part, we discussed about the sources for the history of modern India. If you don't watch that video, press the I button, right corner to your screen, you will get that. So let's start. First thing you need to understand through looking at how histories are written is a part of the study of the intellectual history of the period under discussion and can provide a variety of ideas and explanations. The starting point of the history of a society therefore has to be in a familiarity with its historiography, the study of historical interpretation. This provides recognition of the intellectual context of the history. Instead of seeing history as just a narration of events, the modern history of India, for the convenience of understanding, can be read broadly under four approaches: the colonial or the imperialist, second one is nationalist, third is Marxist, and the subaltern, each with its own distinct characteristics and modes of interpretation. However, there are other approaches also: communalist, Cambridge, liberal, and neo-liberal, and the feminist interpretations, which have also influenced historical writing on modern India. View of Percival Spear, he says that the production of histories of India has become very frequent in recent years and may well call for some explanations. The reason is a twofold one: changes in the Indian scene requiring a reinterpretation of the facts and changes in the attitudes of historians about the essential elements of Indian society. Let's start with the colonial approach, historiography. For the major part of the 19th century, the colonial school occupied a high position in India. The term colonial approach has been used in two senses. One relates to the history of colonial countries, while the other refers to the works which are influenced by the colonial ideology of domination. It is in the second sense that the most historians today write about the colonial historiography. In fact, the practice writing about the colonial countries by the colonial officials was related to desire for domination and justification of colonial rule. Hence, in most such historical works, there was a criticism of indigenous society and culture. Simultaneously, there was a praise for Western culture and values, and glorification of individuals who established the colonial empires. The Historians of India, written by James Mill, Morstart, Elphinstone, Vincent Smith, and many other pretended examples of the colonial historiographical trend. Certain characteristics common to the most of the works of these historians are the following: like the Orientalist representation of India and the opinion of the British brought unity to India, and notions of social Darwinism. The English considered themselves superior to the natives and fittest to rule. India viewed as a stagnant society which required guidance for British white men's burden, and establishing Pax Britannia and to bring law and order and peace in a bickering society. Let's put a light on nationalist approach of historiography. The nationalist approach of Indian history can be described as one which tends to contribute to the growth of nationalist feelings and to unify people in the face of religious, caste, or linguistic differences or class differentiation. This approach looks at a national movement as a movement of Indian people, which grew out of the growing awareness among all the people of the exploitative nature of colonial rule. So this approach develops a response to in confrontation with the colonial approach. It should be noted that the nationalist historians of modern India did not exist before 1947. Before 1947, nationalist historiography mainly dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history. However, in the last quarter of the 19th century, a detailed and scientific critique of colonialism for the adverse economic aspects of alien rule was developed by nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, M.G. Rande, G.V. Ghosh, R.C. Dutt, K.T. Tilang, G.K. Gokhale, and D.E. Vacha. The only accounts of the national movement was by nationalist leaders, not historians such as R.G. Pradhan, A.C. Mazumdar, J.L. Nehru, and Patabi Sitama. And also the R.C. Majumdar and Tara Chand are noted nationalist historians of modern India. Through Marxist historiography approach, the beginning of the Marxist approach in India was heralded by two classic books: Rajni Palami Dutt's India Today and A.R. Desai, Social Background of Indian Nationalism, originally written for the famous Left Book Club in England. India Today, first published in 1940 in England, was later published in India in 1947. A.R. Desai's social background of Indian nationalism was first published in 1948. Unlike the imperialistic colonial approach, the Marxist historians clearly see the primary contradiction between the interests of the colonial masters and the subjective people, as well as the process of nation in the making. Unlike the nationalists, they also take full note of the inner contradictions between the different sections of the people of Indian society. However, some of them, particularly Rajni Palami, Dutt, were unable to fully integrate their treatment for the primary anti-imperialistic contradiction and the secondary inner contradictions, and tended to counterbalance the anti-imperialist struggle with the class or social struggle. They tend to see the national movement as a structure bogus movement. So, if not a bogus movement, and miss it is open-ended and all the character. Another noted that Marxist historian who made a critique of R.P. Dutt's paradigm is a Sumit Sarkar. So he considers Dutt's paradigm as a simplistic version of the Marxist class approach. He looks at the nationalist leaders in the light of intelligentsia, which acts as a kind of proxy for its yet passive social forces with which it had a little organic connection. A.R. Desai traces the growth of national movement in 5 phases, each phase based on a particular social class which supported and sustained it. Now, Subaltern approach, Histography. This school of thought began in the early 19th century under the editorship of Ranjit Guha. As a critique of existing historiography, which has faulted for ignoring the voice of people right from the beginning, subaltern historiography took the position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography had an elitist base. For the subaltern historians, the basic contradiction of Indian society in the colonial epoch was between the elite, both Indian and foreign, on the one hand, and the subaltern groups on the other, and not between the colonialism and the Indian people. However, they do not subscribe to the Marxist theory of nature of exploitation by the nationalist movement. They point out that the Indian society of the time could not be seen in terms of class alone, as capitalism in the country was just a nascent at time, and the school sees nationalism as an exploitive in terms of caste, gender, religious, and creed divisions. Nationalism say that the subalterns ignored the internal and contradictions within the society, as well as what the marginalized represented or had to say. They believe that the Indian people were never united in the common anti-imperialist struggle, but that there was no such entity as Indian national movement. Instead, they assert there was 2 distinct movements or streams: the real anti-imperialist stream of the subalterns and the bogus national movement of the elite. And the elite streams led to the official leadership of the Indian National Congress, were little more than a clock for the struggle for power among the elite. The view of Bipin Chandra Pal, he says that a few historians have a late initiated and a new trend, described by this proportions as subaltern, which dismisses all the previous historical writings, including that based on Marxist perspective, as elite historiography, and claims to replace this old, blinkered historiography with what it claims a new people's or subaltern approach. Now, communalist approach. In communalist approach, the historians of the school relying completely on the colonial historiography of medieval India and colonial era textbooks, viewed that Hindus and Muslims are permanent hostile groups whose interests were mutually different and antagonistic to each other. This view was not only reflected in the writings of historians but also took a more virulent form in the hands of communal political leaders. In their view, India's medieval history was a long story of Hindu-Muslim conflict. As a corollary of this view, it was then argued that in 19th and 20th century, Muslims had a happy and proud ever-present memory of having been a ruling class, while Hindus had a sad and humiliating memory of having been the subject race. This ultimately developed mutual hatred among these groups, often resulting in communal riots, and in the end led to the partition of India. Now the Cambridge School. According to this school of thought, the fundamental contradiction under the colonial rule was not between the imperialism and the people of India, but among the Indians themselves. Further, the Indian nationalism was not a product of struggle of Indian people against the colonial exploitation, but what arose from a conflict among the Indians for getting the benefits given to them by the British rulers. And the leaders of nationalist movement, according to this school, was inspired by the quest for power and material benefits. This approach has been criticized by many scholars on the ground that it takes the mind of ideals out of human behavior and reduces nationalism to animal politics. Now the liberal and neo-liberal interpretations. According to these interpretations, the economic exploitation of the colonies was not beneficial to the British people as a whole. The availability of markets for British industrial goods in the colonial world and capital investment in overseas markets like line of railways in India might have actually discouraged domestic investment and delayed the development of the new industries in Britain. The proponents of the school of thought are Patrick O'Brien, Hopkins and Kane. Now the feminist historiography. The shift in terms of the writing of women's history began with the women's movement in 1970, which provided the context and impetus for the emergence of women's studies in India. Very soon, women's history broadened and assumed a more complex shape of gender history. In the early years, the endeavor was to write a history of women to supplement the writings of mainstream history. Also, an attempt was made to research and complete an archive of women's writing. It is an important area of research has been analysis of the way in which colonial structures such as legal structure affected women's lives. Women's vulnerability due to the denial of ownership of productive resources has been focused on in the analysis of how progressive laws shaped gender relations. In the colonial period, two works based upon the women's question in India, The High Caste Hindu Woman 1887 by Pandita Ramabai and The Mother India 1927 by Catherine Mayo attracted international attention. Now let's summarize and remember the important points regarding the all approaches. First one is colonial approach. It is influenced by the colonial ideology of domination. It focuses on criticism of indigenous society and culture and praises the Western culture and values. James Mill, Vincent Smith, etc. followed this approach. Nationalist approach. It was evolved as a response to and in a confrontation with the colonial approach. Before independence, this school dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history and not on the modern period. After the independence, this school focused on modern India. R.C. Majumdar and Tara Chand belonging to this school. Marxist approach focuses on the primary contradiction between the interests of the colonial matters and a native subjects. It also takes notice of inner contradictions between the different sections of society. R.P. Dutt, A.R. Desai were noted the Marxist historians of India. Subaltern approach takes a position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography has an elitist base and the rule of common masses has been neglected. Ranjit Guha belonging to this school. Communalist approach views Hindus and Muslims were permanently hostile groups whose interests are mutually different and antagonistic to each other. Cambridge School envisages that Indian nationalism as a product of conflicts among the Indians themselves for getting the benefits from British rulers. For them, Indian nationalist leaders were inspired by the greed of power and material benefits. Liberal and neo-liberal, they imply that the economic exploitation of the colonies was not beneficial to the people of Britain and it delayed the development of new industries in Britain. Feminist historiography focuses on areas of research that analyze colonial structures such as legal structure with the affected women's lives. It focuses on women's vulnerability due to the denial of ownership of productive resources. Hope you find this video informative. Thank you for watching it.